Thanks a lot, Mr. Belokas, and thanks for the kind invitation to come to Athens. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back from the coffee break. The topic for this presentation is the latest development regarding legislation of air emissions from shipping. Let's start having a look at the background for all this greenhouse gas discussion. So, what do I do? Oh yeah, okay, forward, yeah, that's right. Okay, here we go. Global warming and climate changes have been high on the agenda for many years, but what has been done until now? In the Kyoto Protocol, it was agreed that developed countries should reduce their greenhouse gases with around 5% by 2012. However, countries like USA and China are not part of this agreement, and it's not very likely, even if the 5% is reached for the countries being a part of this agreement, that the effect is particularly significant. EU has made their own targets and intend to lower their emissions with 20% by 2020. Baseline is 1990, and it seems very unlikely that except for a few countries, that the target will be reached, at least as an in-sector reduction only. Even though the result from the COP16 in Cancun was rather limited, it was agreed to keep the global average temperature rise below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial period. Yeah. So, how much does shipping contribute to the global CO2 emissions? The second IMO greenhouse gas study was launched in 2009. The conclusion in this study was that international shipping contribute with around 870 million tons of CO2, or around 2.7% of the global total CO2 emissions. However, if nothing is done within shipping, the contribution will be around 2 to 3 times higher in 2050. If global shipping is not to exceed 2 degrees in 2100 and all other industries comply with this target and shipping does nothing, then shipping will contribute with 12 to 18% of the total CO2 emissions by 2050. So even though shipping sector transport around 90% of all cargo and only contribute to the global CO2 emissions with less than 3%, we have met a lot of pressure from the society around us. During MEPC 62, which was conducted in July this year, an international agreement to reduce CO2 emissions from shipping was finally adopted by IMO after years of lengthy and intense discussions. Our industry can now proudly state that this is actually the first global mandatory carbon dioxide reduction agreement implemented by any industry. It's also very important that IMO is maintained at center stage when it comes to regulation of international shipping. If IMO hasn't reached this agreement, we might have seen EU step in and impose some kind of regional legislation. In shipping, we do not generally mind international legislation, but we believe that national and regional legislation will distort competition. 7 ship types are presently included in the Energy Efficiency Design Index legislation, namely bulk carriers, gas tankers, tankers, container ships, general cargo ships, refrigerated cargo carriers, and combination carriers, or as we used to call them, oboe carriers. All these ships are deadweight ships. Passenger ships, ro-ro ships, and RoPax ships, they are not deadweight ships and does not presently fit very well into the formula for the attained index. Gross tonnage may be chosen as the capacity factor for passenger ships and RoPax ships if these ships are included in the legislation at a later stage. The amendments to MARPOL Annex 6 will most probably enter into effect in 2013. and will apply to new buildings which are contracted on or after 1st of January 2013 or delivered on or after 1st of July 2015. The first 2 years, from January 2013 to 2014, the reduction factor will be 0. This does not mean that there's no obligation to optimize the energy efficiency of the ship, but that the attained index must not be above the reference line for this particular ship type. The reduction factor will gradually increase, and in 2025 the reduction factor will be 30%. Possibly even more strict requirements will be applied in the future. The EDI legislation does not yet apply to ships with diesel-electric turbine or hybrid propulsion systems. And from 2015 or so, ro-packs and passenger ships may be included in the regulation as well. In order to have the latest amendments to MARPOL Annex 6 adopted, it was necessary to reach a compromise solution. Therefore, administrations are granted a possibility to waive the energy efficiency design index requirements for a ship for an initial limited period. However, the perceived risk of individual countries imposing unilateral bans on ships with waivers or port imposing higher fees for non-EEDI ships should be taken into consideration. Worldwide trading by ships with waivers may thus potentially be compromised, and these ships may become hard or even impossible to sell in a second-hand market due to possible limited trading possibilities. We therefore recommend our members to carefully consider the viability of a waiver for EDI compliance when new buildings are ordered. Regarding the EDI, a model has been developed where an attained EDI is calculated for each new ship. Basically, the formula gives the fuel used per capacity per distance. For example, gram fuel per tons per nautical mile. A model test and a sea trial shall be conducted, and the results shall be converted into speed at 75% MTR with a fully loaded ship. For container ships, only 70% of the dead weight shall be used in the formula. The formula is still being heavily discussed, and for examples are all the F factors for weather, ice strengthening capacity and enhanced scandlings not finalized yet. It also remained unsolved how to incorporate the effect of any shaft generator into the formula. The attained index, as found after the sea trial, will then have to be compared with the reference lines of similar ships. When the EDI enters into force, the attained index for a ship must not be above this reference line. After some years, the attained index must be even lower than the reference line, and in 2025, the attained index must be at least 30% lower than the reference line in future. However, please bear in mind this is only valid for new buildings. The Energy Efficiency Design Index, or the EDI, has now been adopted and will enter into force or into effect 1st of January 2013. However, the EDI legislation will only apply to new buildings, and only a majority of the ship types will be included. In order to motivate ship owners and operators also to lower the CO2 emissions for existing ships, market-based mechanisms or market-based instruments have been proposed as a CO2 mitigating tool for shipping too. Basically, a cost will be added to every ton of CO2 emission from a ship. As CO2 emissions are proportional to the fuel consumption, the owner will get an incentive to save fuel, for example by investment in mitigating technologies. The higher the cost on emission and thereby fuel, the more beneficial the investment will be. 10 proposals for market-based measures have been submitted to IMO. They have been evaluated by an expert group and were discussed again by a working group in March this year. Basically, these market-based instruments may be divided into 3 groups. We got the emission level, which is a price instrument because it fixes the price, while the emission level is allowed to vary according to economic activity. Then we got an emission cap and permit trading system, which is a quantity instrument because it fixes the overall emission level and allows the price to vary. And finally, we got a proposal for an efficiency-based system where the EDI would be incorporated in the evaluation of a ship. During the last intersessional meeting in the Greenhouse Gas Working Group in IMO, the MPIs were divided into two groups, namely MPIs with in-sector reductions and with MPIs with both in-sector and out-of-sector reductions. It is commonly believed that MPIs with both in-sector and out-of-sector reductions are needed if absolute reductions within shipping must be achieved. Besides the new CO2 emission legislation, sulfur and NOx emission legislation is already in force. Sulfur emissions are regulated in MARPOL Annex 6 and in the EU Sulfur Directive. But local and regional legislation may also apply in certain areas. MARPOL Annex 6 currently limits the global sulfur content to 4.5%, but in 2012 the limit will be lowered to 3.5%, and in 2020 or maybe 2025 the limit will be lowered further to 0.5% only. This will probably mean running on gas oil, LNG, or possibly the use of scrubbers. Having a look at the emission control areas, the North Sea and Baltic Sea have already been assigned as ECAs, or emission control areas. Present maximum sulfur content in fuel for these areas is 1%, but from 2015 it's 0.1%. The North Sea and Baltic Sea have not yet been assigned as NOx emission control areas, but it seems likely that this will happen before 2016 when Tier 3 enters into force. North America has been assigned as an ECA for both SOx and NOx and will enter into effect 1st of August 2012. Puerto Rico and US Virgin Islands, also called the US Caribbean area, have also been assigned as both SOx and NOx ECAs and will enter into effect from 1st of January 2014. The European Commission has proposed a revision of the Sulfur Directive, which will go through the normal procedures within the EU. In general, the proposal is in line with MARPOL Annex 6, and it should be noted that the European Commission has not changed its position despite efforts to weaken the 0.1 ECA sulfur limit, which is applicable from 2015. The proposal to amend the directive deviates from MARPOL in few cases. It is not aligned with MARPOL Annex 6 regarding the possibility for states, in the event ships cannot source compliant fuel, to grant such non-compliant ships access to their ports. And this could potentially give ship owners compliance problems, as states do not have the possibility of deviating from these regulations. Another matter which is not aligned with the MARPOL Annex 6 is that members of the EU shall ensure that marine fuel is not used or placed on the market within their territory if the fuel content exceeds 3.5%. Fuel with a sulfur content of more than 3.5% is then not allowed to be used, even in combination with abatement technology. This deviation is problematic, as fuel with higher sulfur content is accepted in the rest of the world, and the proposal is therefore unnecessarily prescriptive. You should furthermore note that the proposal specifically requires that the absolute maximum sulfur limit on 3.5% shall apply to all ships of all flags, including ships whose voyage began outside the EU. At birth, fuel with a maximum sulfur content of 0.1% also deviate from MARPOL Annex 6, but this is already in force in the present EC Sulfur Directive. From 2020, passenger ships within EU must use fuel with a maximum sulfur content of maximum 0.1%, where the present limit is 1.5%. Due to the intense and lengthy discussions during MEPC this summer, a lot of submissions and discussions were postponed until next MEPC 63, which is going to be conducted end of February next year. It was also agreed that an intersessional meeting should take place in January in order to prepare as much as possible for the MEPC meeting. Some of the outstanding items is how to calculate the EDI. The influence of any shaft generator into the formula has to be solved, and all the F factors have to be dealt with. Survey and certification of the EDI have to be clarified. It will be necessary to agree upon certain standards on how to conduct the tank test and how to conduct the sea trials. The easiest way to fulfill the EDI requirements is just to lower the speed of the ship. However, some organizations have remarked that this could cause some safety aspects in case that the speed or propulsion power will become too low in order to maneuver the ship in adverse weather conditions. Ajax has proposed a guideline to cope with this, and it will have to be discussed further. Other propulsion systems like diesel engine, diesel electric turbine and hybrid propulsion systems are yet not part of the EDI legislation. This will also be on the agenda for the next meeting. Some organizations have pointed out that especially the very large segments of tankers and bulkers do not seem to fit into the reference lines. As a small size segment and they are exempted from the legislation, it may also be necessary to make some kind of adjustment for the large size segment of especially tankers and bulkers. So, ladies and gentlemen, ship owners and operators are facing some serious challenges within the next couple of years. From 2013, most new buildings have to comply with the new CO2 emission regulations. And some shipyards, they may have to improve their naval architectural skills in order to comply with these regulations. And from 2015, ship owners who are operating ships within the ECAS will have to decide whether they will just switch from heavy fuel to gas oil and then pay for the very high extra fuel cost. Or if they are willing to take the chance and invest in new technology like scrubbers or even LNG, even though the investment are high, the LNG infrastructure not yet in place, and the future fuel oil price and LNG price are unknown. So no matter which solution ship owners and operators decide to go for, there are some major uncertainties involved. However, taking the right decision in right time may very well make the difference of staying in business or not. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.